This presentation was given at the Canadian Scientific and Christian Affiliation Conference at Trinity Western University. We will attempt to summarize 30 years of work in 20 minutes. It is not possible in such a short time to prove anything or even explain anything adequately. Instead, I will present a brief history and mention one or two key conclusions from each stage in this history. It started in the 1980s with a system of cognitive styles. This developed into a cognitive model which was applied to psychology and counseling. Theological principles gradually started to appear. The thinking behind science was examined. Other theories of cognition were also examined from a cognitive perspective. The same methodology was then applied to the biblical text, including what is regarded as supernatural or spiritual. We will now look at these 8 points in more detail. The basic premise of cognitive styles is that people can be categorized into different styles of thinking. Romans 12 opens by talking about the mind, as shown by the commonly quoted phrase, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." The next verses describe what this means. In verses 6 to 8, one finds a list of 7 different cognitive styles, and the context implies that these gifts are related to the mind. The connection between Romans 12 spiritual gifts and cognitive styles was first made in the 1970s and is still taught today in a religious context. My brother Lane Friesen went beyond this religious mindset by using Romans 12 spiritual gifts to analyze 200 biographies. This resulted in 7 lists of traits which my brother put into book form. As we examined these lists of traits, we realized that each list could be summarized by a few core traits. Going further, I found that these core traits correspond to the functioning of major brain regions. For instance, I am a perceiver person who thinks naturally in terms of connections, objects, and maps. This is a function of the right parietal cortex. In the 1980s, one could come up with a general mapping between cognitive styles and brain regions. Far more is now known about the brain, and this new evidence is consistent in detail with what we have discovered from cognitive styles. This correspondence is described in a 70-page appendix to Natural Cognitive Theology. One of the byproducts of escaping a religious mindset was that churches and religious organizations lost interest in our work. The cognitive model can be summarized by a simple diagram, which I refer to as the diagram of mental symmetry. Many details have been added to this diagram over the years, but it still summarizes the essence of the theory. The 7 names of the cognitive styles are in the middle of the diagram, and the lines and arrows indicate how they are connected. The teacher and server use analytical or left hemisphere processing. The mercy and perceiver use associative or right hemisphere processing. Information can be given either an emotional label or else given a label of confidence or certainty. The exhorter and contributor emphasize processing that occurs within the basal ganglia. The exhorter provides drive and is related to dopamine, while the contributor chooses and optimizes. Finally, the facilitator adjusts, and this kind of thinking can be seen in the thalamus. Normally, one would take several hours to discuss various details of this diagram. We will limit ourselves to 2 key points. First, the 7 names can refer either to people or to parts of the mind. For instance, one can talk about a server person, or one can talk about server thought. Server thought is present in all people because everyone has the same kind of brain with the same 7 interacting modules. But the server person appears to be conscious in server thought in a way that the other cognitive styles are not. A similar principle would apply to all cognitive styles. Second, there are 2 kinds of emotion. Mercy thought applies emotional labels to concrete experiences, which are triggered associatively by the experiences of normal life. For instance, suppose that I am in some foreign country and see a familiar fast food restaurant. This will feel good, because it will bring back memories of home. There is also an abstract emotion associated with teacher thought. Teacher thought feels good when many items fit together in a simple way, which happens when coming up with a simple explanation or a general theory. Even though teacher emotion is ubiquitous, it is seldom discussed, though that is starting to change. The word shalom in Hebrew means wholeness. Mental symmetry makes it possible to define shalom more precisely as all 7 modules working together. Each person will naturally develop and use the module that is conscious, while naturally ignoring modules that are outside of conscious awareness. If one examines how each cognitive style uses conscious thought, one can assemble a composite picture of how a whole mind would function. In other words, how does a perceiver person use perceiver thought? How does a server person use server thought? And so on. This composite picture of mental wholeness naturally turns is into ought, because one is assembling observation of how minds do work to determine how the mind could work. The process of developing the mind relates to Piaget's stages of cognitive development. Going further, each cognitive style struggles with a predictable set of issues. For instance, the perceiver person finds it difficult to deal with injustice and struggles with anger. This knowledge is very useful for counseling. We will now turn our attention from analyzing people to looking at how the mind forms images of people. The mercy person thinks naturally in terms of people, which implies that everyone uses mercy thought to form mental concepts of people. A mental concept of a person is a collection of emotional experiences associated with that person, which I refer to as a mental network. It is possible to form mental concepts of people who do not exist. For instance, even though Santa Claus does not exist, we all have a collection of emotional memories associated with the imaginary person of Santa Claus, which predict how Santa Claus would behave. A general theory in teacher thought is also a package of emotional memories, and when a person continues to work with some general theory, then it will also turn into a mental network. Mercy thought, which thinks in terms of people, will naturally interpret a general theory as a kind of imaginary person. But a general theory, such as the theory of gravity, does not reside in any specific location. Thus, mercy thought will naturally interpret a universal theory as a universal imaginary person who lives within words outside of space and time. Saying this more succinctly, a concept of God emerges when a sufficiently general theory applies to personal identity. This concept of God will naturally emerge whether such a God actually exists or not, and it will use emotional pressure to guide thinking and behavior. Therefore, one can study how the mind forms a concept of God while postponing the question of whether or not God actually exists. Because a concept of God emerges when a universal theory affects personal identity, one can view a concept of God from either a mercy or a teacher perspective. This distinction can be seen in two quotes by the physicist Paul Dirac. In 1927, Paul Dirac defined a concept of God as someone transcendent, who affects personal human experiences within mercy thought. He concluded that science has eliminated the need for such a concept of God. But in 1963, Paul Dirac redefined a concept of God as a personalization of the universal teacher order of the natural universe in which people live. Science leads naturally to this concept of God. The relationship between these two concepts of God has been investigated by experiments carried out by the cognitive science of religion. Teacher thought uses words to come up with theories. One can learn how teacher thought initially forms theories about words by observing how children come up with rules of grammar. Linguists have found that children will begin by overgeneralizing, saying things like, "I goed to the store." These overgeneralized theories will then be restricted by exceptions to the rule. Saying this in terms of cognitive modules, teacher thought comes up with a universal statement. And then perceiver thought uses facts to limit the domain of this statement. Overgeneralization feels good because one is making a simple statement in teacher thought that applies to many situations, and teacher thought functions emotionally. However, if one overgeneralizes about painful experiences, then this will create a conflict between teacher and mercy emotion. In general, facts are the enemy of overgeneralization. I suggested that a concept of God emerges when a sufficiently general theory applies to personal identity. The simplest overgeneralization is to state that all is one. This is a single sweeping statement that covers everything. For instance, notice how this poster overgeneralizes all religions into a single statement about light. The easiest way to apply something to personal identity is through identification. One can see this in the behavior of the young child, who will pretend to be a fireman, a nurse, or an airplane. If overgeneralization and identification are both common in children, this tells us that these mental strategies emerge naturally when the mind is starting to develop. Mysticism combines overgeneralization in teacher thought with identification in mercy thought, as illustrated by the joke of the Buddha ordering a hot dog and saying, "Make me one with everything." Mystical experiences are often analyzed using technical language, but the mystic will stress that analyzing mysticism is actually a hindrance to achieving mysticism. I mentioned that facts are the enemy of overgeneralization. Similarly, mysticism typically dismisses facts about physical reality either by stating that the world is an illusion or by stating that God is an incomprehensible mystery who transcends all rational thought. We will now turn our attention from emotional thought to technical thought. Our study of cognitive styles showed that the contributor person naturally uses one of two different kinds of technical thought. Abstract technical thought uses words to work with theories, guided by precise definitions, as illustrated by logic and mathematics. Concrete technical thought uses actions to pursue some bottom line, guided by principles of cause and effect, as illustrated by fields such as business or professional sports. One can find these same two kinds of technical thought interacting in science. On the one hand, one can use abstract math with its symbols and precise definitions to describe the behavior of the natural world. On the other hand, one can also learn about the behavior of the world by using concrete thought to perform experiments that uncover relationships of cause and effect. Science has discovered that these two totally different approaches lead to the same results. Looking at this cognitively, there is an aspect of the universe that is consistent with abstract technical thought, an aspect that is consistent with concrete thought, and these two are consistent with one another. This interplay can be seen in the term exemplar. Turning now to theology, one sees these same two aspects connecting together in incarnation. On the one hand, incarnation is described as the Word who lives with God, similar to the way that the words of mathematics live with the universality of natural law. On the other hand, incarnation is also described as the Word made flesh, who lived with humanity, similar to the way that experimental principles of cause and effect flesh out the universal laws of nature. Jesus said several times in the Gospel of John that he only did what he saw the Father doing, telling us that these two aspects of incarnation are consistent with one another. Summarizing, one finds the same kind of interaction within the mind between the two sides of contributor thought, within physical reality between math and experiment, and within theology between the divine and human side of incarnation. Going further, the Bible describes incarnation as a sinless person. Similarly, the principle of least action says that every natural process occurs in a manner that is inhumanly perfect. This correspondence between technical thought, science, and incarnation is explored in the book Natural Cognitive Theology. Emotions interact with technical thought. Thomas Kuhn explored this relationship in his famous work on paradigm shifts. A paradigm is a general theory in teacher thought that satisfies an emotional need. A scientist needs a paradigm and will only let go of one paradigm if given a better alternative. A scientist will experience negative emotions when a paradigm falls apart, and will typically respond with emotions such as sarcasm or personal belittling when a paradigm is threatened or questioned. Technical thinking is not emotional, and Kuhn said that scientists spend most of their time using technical thought to solve puzzles within some paradigm. Because technical thought assumes some paradigm, it cannot be used to test alternative paradigms. Instead, I suggest that a paradigm is like a set of eyeglasses. One tests a set of glasses by wearing them and then checking how much one can see and how clearly one can see. Similarly, I suggest that one tests a paradigm by wearing it and then testing it for scope and clarity. For instance, mysticism has infinite scope because it provides a simple explanation for everything. But it has zero clarity because one cannot add factual details to overgeneralization, but rather must remain at the blurry level of sweeping statements. Testing a paradigm is different than checking facts. Checking facts involves perceiver thought, and the primary struggle there is between blind faith and evidence. Testing a paradigm, in contrast, involves teacher thought. If mental symmetry is a good paradigm, then it should be possible to use it as a set of eyeglasses to view other theories of personality. One does this by asking three primary questions. 1. What cognitive modules are being used? For instance, a paradigm involves teacher thought, because teacher thought looks for general theories. Facts involve perceiver thought, because perceiver thought evaluates facts. 2. How are these various cognitive modules interacting? For instance, mysticism uses teacher thought at the expense of perceiver thought, because it comes up with a universal theory by regarding all facts as ultimately illusion. 3. Are there common patterns of behavior? For instance, both childish grammar and mysticism use the same cognitive mechanism of teacher overgeneralization. TESOL teaches English to speakers of other languages. This may sound straightforward, but learning a new language means acquiring a new paradigm within teacher thought, while learning to live with a new set of cultural experiences within mercy thought. Angelina Van Dyke and I recently used the theory of mental symmetry to provide an integrated explanation for about 15 different aspects of the TESOL field, and we presented several papers at TESOL conferences. The cognitive science of religion examines religion from a cognitive perspective, similar to the approach that I have been using, and the experimental findings of CSR fit nicely into the theory of mental symmetry. For instance, one can use mental networks to explain what CSR refers to as the agency detector. We began by talking about cognitive styles and cognitive modules. Cognitive modules can interact in one of three primary ways, which can be seen in both abstract and concrete thought. Mental networks are controlled by the emotional modules of teacher and mercy thought, and we have looked at several examples of mental networks. Technical thought emerges when contributor thought takes charge of the mind. A field typically enters technical thought by going through some process of official accreditation, and the standards of technical thought will then be enforced by some accrediting body. Normal thought is based upon patterns and analogies described by Lakoff and Johnson in Metaphors We Live By. Normal thought is guided by the patterns and analogies of perceiver and server thought. The theory of mental symmetry uses primarily the patterns and analogies of normal thought. In my experience, those who use technical thought typically respond to this theory by saying that I am using the wrong kind of thinking. Similarly, those who use mental networks usually respond with the gut reaction that I am using the wrong kind of thinking. However, if one wishes to come up with a universal theory, then I suggest that one has to use the patterns and analogies of normal thought. About 3 years ago, I started looking at the Bible in detail, using the same methodology, asking the same 3 questions. What cognitive modules are being used? How are they interacting? And what are the underlying patterns and sequences? Asking which cognitive modules are being used leads to the idea of cognitively natural symbolism, similar to what Lakoff and Johnson describe. For instance, mercy thought lives in a sea of emotional experiences. which acquires stability as perceiver thought builds solid connections between these experiences. Thus, water is a cognitively natural symbol of mercy experiences, while rock naturally symbolizes solid perceiver facts. I have now applied this methodology to 1/3 of the New Testament, looking verse by verse at the original Greek text, focusing upon the more difficult passages and books, as well as examining numerous chapters within the Pentateuch. I have found that the biblical text comes into focus at the level of a textbook when one applies a cognitive methodology. I am not saying that the Bible is a textbook of science. Rather, I am suggesting that the Bible may be a textbook of cognition. In other words, the theory of mental symmetry provides a good set of eyeglasses for viewing the Bible, because it provides both scope and clarity. I have posted about 1,000 pages of this cognitive analysis on my website. The Bible talks about miracles, and we all know that miracles violate the materialistic paradigms of science. In contrast, the theory of mental symmetry can be naturally extended to include the supernatural and the spiritual. In brief, living within the natural world resonates with concrete thought. One can also conceive of a sort of mirror image, supernatural universe that would resonate with what we call abstract thought, similar to the duality in physics between particles and waves. Going further, it appears that the spiritual realm can be explained as an external environment that resonates with mental networks. Thus, one can use rational thought to explore topics such as the supernatural and the spiritual, while postponing the question of whether such realms actually exist. As mentioned, this talk will be on YouTube, and there is also 3,500 pages of information on the website. The more academic information has been posted to Academia and ResearchGate, and 2 books are available on Amazon.com, both in Kindle and print version. Thank you for watching.